The story you've been told is a lie. We think the partition of India was about religion. We think it was about Gandhi and Jinnah and the noble dream of freedom. We've been taught that the horror that followed was an unfortunate but inevitable clash of faiths. But that's not what happened. What happened in the summer of 1947 was a liquidation sale. The British Empire didn't grant independence out of moral awakening. They fled because they were bankrupt. And when empires go bankrupt, they don't care who pays the bill. On the 12th of August 1947, a man sat alone in a sweltering room in New Delhi. His me was Cyril Radcliffe. He was sweating through a wool suit designed for London fog. In front of him were stacks of outdated maps and census data he barely understood. He had 5 weeks to draw a line across a subcontinent. That line would divide 400 million people. And here's the part that should terrify you. He had never set foot in India before that moment. Let's rewind. In 1919, the British Empire looked invincible. It controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface. The sun never set on British territory. India was the crown jewel. It supplied cotton, tea, opium, soldiers, and tax revenue that poured into London like water. The ledger looked healthy. The balance sheet seemed strong. British officers rode elephants through Delhi. They built railways that connected Calcutta to Karachi. They taxed the peasants and sent the gold back to Westminster. But empires don't collapse because they lose battles. They collapse because they run out of cash. By 1945, Britain had won World War II. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The cost was catastrophic. Britain had borrowed over £3 billion from the United States alone. It owed another $1 billion to Canada. The factories were bombed. The shipping lanes were devastated. London was still digging bodies out of rubble. The British public was rationing bread. They were burning furniture to stay warm. The last thing they wanted was to send their sons to die keeping peace between Hindus and Muslims in a place most of them couldn't find on a map. The empire was no longer profitable. It was a liability leading the treasury dry. Here's where the addiction begins. For 2 centuries, Britain had used India as a financial crutch. Indian taxes paid for British wars. Indian soldiers fought British battles. Indian resources fed British industry. But after the war, the math didn't work anymore. Administering India cost more than the colony generated. The nationalists were demanding independence. The strikes were constant. The cost of suppression was rising every month. Clement Attlee's Labour government looked at the ledger and saw only red ink. They made a decision that would reshape the world. Get out fast. Liquidate the asset before it becomes a total loss. But here's the problem. You can't just walk away from 400 million people. If the British left without a plan, the subcontinent would erupt into civil war. The Muslims wanted their own state. The Hindus wanted a unified India. The Sikhs wanted protection. The princes wanted autonomy. It was a powder keg soaked in gasoline. The British needed a solution that looked responsible, but cost them nothing. So they decided to partition the country. They would create 2 nations. India for the Hindus. Pakistan for the Muslims. Clean, simple, final. Except it wasn't simple. Nobody knew where the border should be. The religions were mixed everywhere. Muslims lived in Hindu neighborhoods. Hindus owned land in Muslim-majority provinces. The Sikhs were scattered across the Punjab. Drawing a line through this human mosaic would require years of negotiation and surveying. It would require understanding the water systems and the railways and the power grids. It would require listening to the people who actually live there. The British didn't have years. They didn't even have months. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the last viceroy, had moved the independence date forward. He wanted the British out by August 15th, 1947. That gave them 6 weeks. 6 weeks to divide a civilization. Think about the scale of that. The British government needed someone to draw the line. But it couldn't be an Indian politician. Both sides would scream bias. It couldn't be a British administrator who'd lived in India for decades. They would have loyalties and friendships that could compromise neutrality. The solution they came up with reveals the depth of their cynicism. They needed someone who knew nothing. They believed ignorance was the same thing as impartiality. So they went shopping in the legal directories of London and found Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe was a brilliant barrister. He specialized in tax law and property disputes. He'd never practiced colonial law. He'd never studied Indian geography. He'd never read a book about the Punjab or Bengal. He knew nothing about irrigation canals or railway junctions. He'd never met a Sikh. He couldn't speak a word of Hindi or Urdu. He was the perfect blank slate. When they offered him the job, they told him he'd have a few months. He accepted out of duty. Then he arrived in Delhi on July 8, 1947, and Mountbatten told him the truth. He had 5 weeks, not 5 months. 5 weeks. Let that number sink in. 5 weeks to decide the fate of a subcontinent. Radcliffe was horrified. He told Mountbatten it was impossible. He explained that proper surveying would require visiting the villages. It would require understanding where the water flowed and who owned the land. It would require time. Mountbatten didn't care. He told Radcliffe that delay would cause riots. He said the violence was already starting. If they didn't separate the two sides immediately, the whole country would burn. Radcliffe was trapped. He couldn't back out. He was told he was the only thing standing between India and total chaos. So he locked himself in a room. He was given 4 judges to assist him, 2 Muslims and 2 Hindus, but they didn't assist. They argued. Every time Radcliffe proposed a line, one side screamed betrayal. The meetings became shouting matches. Radcliffe stopped listening. He retreated into his maps. Those maps were his only guide, and the maps were ancient. Some of them hadn't been updated since the 1920s. They showed rivers that had changed course. They showed towns that no longer existed. They didn't show the new villages that had sprouted up. They didn't show who lived where. Radcliffe didn't know that a canal he saw on the map was owned by a Hindu landlord but irrigated Muslim farms. He didn't know that a Sikh holy shrine sat next to a Muslim graveyard. He saw topography. He saw a river and thought it would make a natural border. He didn't know the river flooded every monsoon and shifted its banks. He didn't know the people on both sides were from the same clan. He drew his pencil along what looked neat on paper. He was cutting through living communities. He just couldn't see them. The pressure was destroying him. He was terrified of assassination. He knew that whatever line he drew, millions would hate him. He stopped going out. He ate alone. He worked 16 hours a day staring at paper until his vision blurred. The heat was murderous. The dust invaded everything. He lost weight. He wrote letters home describing the torture of the work. He wrote that the heat killed all energy. He knew people would suffer because of his decisions. He wasn't cruel. He was a bureaucrat handed a gun and told to shoot into a crowd in the dark. The specific problems he faced were agonizing. Take the Punjab. It was the breadbasket. Wheat fields and rivers and irrigation systems. The population was Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh in roughly equal measure. The Sikhs were the nightmare. They were a distinct group with their own holy sites. Their capital was Amritsar. Their lands were scattered across the middle of the province. There was no way to give them a separate country. They had to go in either India or Pakistan. But wherever he put them, they'd be divided. If he gave the western Punjab to Pakistan, the Sikhs there would be stranded. If he gave it to India, he'd cut off Muslim-majority areas. He received delegations of Sikh leaders who wept and threatened. They told him about their sacred shrines. Radcliffe listened, but he looked at his map and saw that the shrines were scattered everywhere. He couldn't draw a circle around them. He could only draw a straight line, so he made a decision. He gave Lahore to Pakistan. He gave Amritsar to India. It looked neat. But on the ground it meant a Sikh farmer 10 miles from Amritsar woke up in a foreign country. Then there was Bengal in the east. Calcutta was the industrial hub. It had jute mills and factories and a massive port. The countryside around it was Muslim majority. The Muslim League wanted Calcutta for Pakistan. They argued that without the port, East Pakistan would be an economic cripple. The Indian Congress argued that Calcutta was a Hindu city. Radcliffe had to choose. If he gave Calcutta to Pakistan, the Hindus would riot. If he gave it to India, East Pakistan would be destitute. He sat alone and weighed the economic viability of a nation against the demographics of a city. He gave Calcutta to India. That single decision doomed East Pakistan to decades of poverty. But in that moment he was just balancing the ledger. As August 15th approached, the atmosphere turned manic. Radcliffe was working with reckless speed. He was deciding the fate of millions in minutes. He looked at a district called Gurdaspur. It had a slight Muslim majority. By the rules, it should go to Pakistan, but it also controlled the road to Kashmir. If he gave it to Pakistan, India would be cut off from Kashmir. He paused. He thought about the strategic implications. He thought about the water systems. In a moment of hesitation, or perhaps calculated strategy, he drew the line to give Gurdaspur to India. That one flick of his pencil led to wars that are still being fought today. By August 12th, the work was done. Radcliffe was exhausted. He'd created 2 zigzag lines stretching thousands of miles. He presented his award to Mountbatten. He expected the map would be published immediately so people would know where to go. He expected the British Army would be deployed to keep the peace. But here the betrayal deepens. Mountbatten looked at the maps and saw they would cause outrage. He saw the Sikhs would be furious. He saw the Muslims would feel cheated. And he looked at the calendar. Independence Day was August 15th. Mountbatten wanted the celebrations to be joyful. He wanted flags waving and bands playing. He didn't want riots to mar his moment of glory. So he made a choice that's hard to forgive. He locked the maps in his safe. He decided not to publish the border until August 17th, 2 days after independence. He wanted the British to be technically gone before the bad news broke. He wanted to wash his hands of the chaos. So on the morning of August 15th, 1947, millions of people woke up free. The British flag came down. The new flags went up. There were speeches. There were fireworks. But in the borderlands, nobody knew which country they were in. The police didn't know whose laws to enforce. The soldiers didn't know which generals to obey. Rumors swept through the villages. A rumor would say they'd been given to Pakistan and the Hindus would panic. A counter-rumor would say they were in India and the Muslims would panic. The uncertainty created a vacuum of fear, and into that vacuum stepped the men of violence. Local militias and gangs and extremists had been preparing. They saw the confusion as opportunity. They told their people that the only way to be safe was to cleanse the land. If you didn't know where the border was, you made your own border with a sword. Radcliffe stayed in Delhi for the independence ceremonies. He watched the joy from a distance. He knew the secret locked in the safe. He knew the cheers would turn to screams. He felt like a criminal. He'd packed his suitcase. He prepared to leave. He didn't wait for the announcement. He didn't wait to see the results of his work. He wanted to get as far from India as possible. But even as he headed for the airport on August 17th, the first trains were already burning. On August 17th, the maps were released. The radio announcements were made. The newspapers printed the jagged lines. The suspense broke, but it was replaced by terror. Across the Punjab, the realization hit millions at once. They were on the wrong side. A farmer who'd lived on his land for 40 years found out his farm was in a foreign country. A country defined by a religion he didn't belong to. Sikh farmers in West Punjab realized they were now in Pakistan. Muslim artisans in Delhi realized they were in India. The logic of partition said they should move. But moving meant abandoning everything. At first there was denial. People thought it was a mistake. They thought the line would be adjusted. But the violence that erupted was systematic. In the Punjab, militias had been stockpiling weapons. When the line was announced, the cleansing began. The message was simple: leave or die. In the villages, drums beat at night. Mobs surrounded settlements. They set fires to trap the inhabitants. The brutality is hard to describe, but necessary to understand. This wasn't war between armies. It was neighbors turning on neighbors. The trains became the arteries of death. Refugees flooded the stations. They climbed onto roofs. They hung off the sides. The trains were so packed people died of suffocation before they moved. But the real horror happened on the tracks. Trains had to cross the new border. As a train full of Hindu refugees left Pakistan, it would be ambushed. The tracks would be sabotaged. The train would stop. Men with swords would board. They moved from compartment to compartment. When the train pulled into the station in India, the doors opened. Silence poured out. These became known as the ghost trains. Sometimes only the driver survived. He'd be given a note to deliver to the other side. This happened in both directions. A train of slaughtered Muslims arriving in Lahore. A train of slaughtered Hindus arriving in Amritsar. The railway lines Radcliffe had seen as black ink on paper had become rivers of blood. The roads were no better. Because trains were death traps, people walked. They formed columns called kafilas. Some were 50 miles long. Imagine a snake of humanity stretching to the horizon. Hundreds of thousands walking barefoot in the dust. They carried children on their shoulders. They carried bundles on their heads. They had no food. They had no water. The elderly dropped dead from exhaustion. Mothers who couldn't carry their babies had to choose, leave them or die with them. And these columns were attacked. Cavalry charged into defenseless crowds swinging sabers. Women were abducted by the thousands. It was a weapon to dishonor the enemy. 15 million people crossed the border. It's the largest migration in human history. It happened in months. Where was the British Empire? Where were the troops? This is the second great betrayal. The British had 50,000 troops still in India. They had the Punjab boundary force, but the orders from London were clear. Save the British. Commanders were told not to intervene. They were told to protect British civilians and ensure safe withdrawal. British regiments sat in barracks listening to nearby villages being massacred. They did nothing. They had orders. The officer class that prided itself on law and order stood by and watched it burn. They were busy packing their cricket bats. Cyril Radcliffe was back in London when the worst news arrived. He was in a flat in Mayfair. He opened the newspapers. He saw the photographs, vultures circling refugee columns, cholera outbreaks in camps, estimates of the dead, 200,000, 500,000, 1 million. Eventually, the figure settled around 2 million. 2 million lives extinguished because of a line drawn in 5 weeks. Radcliffe was devastated. He told friends he couldn't sleep. He realized every wiggle of his pencil had been a death sentence. He'd drawn a line through a canal and cut off water. That village died of thirst. He'd drawn a line through a road and cut off escape. That community was slaughtered. The British government tried to pay him £3,000, a significant sum. Radcliffe refused it. He said he couldn't accept payment for work that caused such suffering. It was a gesture of conscience, but it felt hollow. Refusing money didn't bring back the dead. Radcliffe never returned to India. He was afraid to. He knew millions cursed his name. He went back to his law practice. He became a peer. He lived until 1977, but he lived with the ghost of the map. He once told a journalist years later he suspected they'd shoot him if he went back. He was probably right. The legacy didn't end in 1947. The rushed border created permanent fault lines. The most dangerous was Kashmir. Because Radcliffe gave Gurdaspur to India, India had a road link to Kashmir. This allowed Indian troops to enter when the Maharaja hesitated. If Radcliffe had drawn that line differently, Kashmir might have gone to Pakistan automatically. Instead, the two nations went to war immediately. They've fought 3 more wars since. They've developed nuclear weapons pointing at each other.